I strongly believe that those Republicans answering the polls that they like tariffs, they don't like tariffs. They love President Trump. If President Trump were to watch this podcast and say, well, boy, that Bryan guy made a lot of good points. We're going to do what Milton Friedman said and just go unilateral free trade, get rid of everything. I would suspect most of those people answering the polls, we love tariffs, would now answer, we love getting rid of the tariffs.
Hello. Welcome again to another episode in the Let People Prosper show. My name is Dr. Vance Ginn. I hope you're having a prosperous day. Well, today I'm joined by someone I have long followed and respected in the world of trade policy and just doing a lot of work about free markets and other things. And it's none other than Bryan Riley. Bryan, welcome to the Let People Prosper show.
Thanks for having me on. It's great to see you, and look forward to a good conversation about trade policy.
Same here. And before we get too far, along with this, let me go ahead and read your bio for the audience, and then we'll jump right into it. So Bryan Riley is the director of the Free Trade Initiative at the National Taxpayers Union and one of the leading voices making the case that trade isn't just about economics, it's about opportunity, prosperity, and freedom. Bryan was named one of DC's 500 most influential people of 2025 by Washingtonian magazine. He has spent years fighting protectionism and corporate favoritism, leading grassroots campaigns in support of NAFTA, and pushing back against efforts to get government picking winners and losers. With degrees in economics from Kansas State and USC, and a career that began in Washington, D.C. as a Reagan-era intern at NTU, he brings a principled and data-driven approach to trade. I'm excited to dig into what's happening in the world of tariffs, supply chains, and trade policy today, and what it all means for America's future and ultimately to you, the audience. So we've got a lot to talk about because there's so much that's going on. But let's go ahead and start here, Bryan, where I do all the other guests. Why do you do what you do every day?
Well, I'd love to answer that, but before I do, I want to say how much I like your work, and I love the name of your podcast, Let People Prosper. Vance, I have had for years a web domain reserved called Everything Works If You Let It. And I think maybe a little similar to the direction you're going, which is let people prosper, get out of their way, and remove the barriers that exist that allow people to prosper. And so I wanted to be sure and mention that before getting into my talking about myself for a few minutes. So I grew up in Manhattan, Kansas, where Kansas State University is located. My dad was on the faculty there. Vance, we had a pig farm outside of town. We called them we were pig farmers, not pork producers. I think now we would be called pork producers. So, growing up, I remember, at some point asking my dad, to tell that question about to explain how the world works. Who knows what I actually asked him, but I remember his answer. And this, well, you'll sound like I'm making it up because it's just such a basic thing. He told me again when I was very young that there are two ways of looking at how the world works. One way is there is a fixed pie, and we all fight over that pie to get the most we can at the expense of someone else. And the other is that we have a growing pie and engage in mutually beneficial transactions. And that if I prosper, it doesn't mean you're getting poorer. And in all likelihood, if I prosper, I'm probably doing it by helping other people prosper as well. Obviously, I'm putting this in my own words and misremembering probably the details of what he had said. So he probably had no idea that whether by coincidence or for whatever reason, that would inform a lot of the work that I've been doing ever since, is to promote policies that grow the pie, that help people, be able to engage in mutually beneficial transactions and be better off. Growing up, I went to Kansas State University, didn't know what I wanted to study. My parents had their ideas of what I should do. I made the mistake of taking a couple of economics classes, Vance, that I thought were super interesting. Probably because we had good teachers. You know how that works. These guys, they can make something sound exciting, sound awful, and vice versa. And I decided I wanted to get a PhD in economics. And I went to the University of Southern California. Big change, by the way, from Manhattan, Kansas. And took a few classes, and I just decided that the PhD route was not for me. The work that economists do is incredibly important, but it was very I don't mean this in a bad way, ivory tower. The kind of work that economists do is very deep, and I wanted to. It wasn't something I could see myself focusing on for the rest of my life. And at the time, there was a recession, in effect. So jobs were a little bit tight. And a couple of my old buddies from Kansas were working on Capitol Hill. And they said, you should come to DC. And I remember, Vance, one of them said, if you're kind of smart, but don't have any real skills, DC is a good place to come. So I don't know how smart I am, but I wasn't prepared to go start, tearing down engines or roof a house or anything like that. So I moved to DC and wound up working at an advocacy organization called Citizens for a Sound Economy that has since grown or changed, and it sort of was a precursor to Americans for Prosperity in some ways. And when I was there, they needed somebody to work on trade policy. We had we worked a lot on tax and budget policy. The person who was working on trade policy left, and I was there as a little part-time policy analyst. And so I started working there when the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, was being considered, the World Trade Organization was being created, and things like that. And at the time, I just thought this stuff was par for the course. We did it all the time and didn't realize really what a unique moment in history that we had. Since then, since 1994, we've had about 1 billion people around the world, with a B, 1 billion people lifted out of the worst poverty. That's difficult to even imagine. Foreign trade barriers, after we enacted those agreements, foreign barriers fell by about 2/3. Median household income. So for those who don't know, median's just the right in the middle. Personal income, I should say, is increased by about $12,000 since then. For those who are concerned about immigration, after we passed NAFTA, illegal immigration from Mexico dropped by about 70%. Without having to hire a new ICE officer or build any walls, it turns out that if you give people a chance to have jobs at home, they don't really care to pack up and move halfway around the world. Yeah. So I think it would be really tragic to move away from that track record. And so then I've had some different opportunities over the years. I worked at the Heritage Foundation, which has a publication called the Index of Economic Freedom. We rank countries around the world. It shows that typically countries which have more economic freedom are more prosperous. People are better off. So that was a great experience. And trust me, I'm getting to the end here.
No, you're good. You're good.
Then, National Taxpayers Union, about the time President Trump first took office, they had worked a lot on trade policy on a bipartisan basis. And, we decided to start what we call the Free Trade Initiative. And National Taxpayers Union we're a grassroots organization that represents taxpayer interests. And at the time, we're concerned that the biggest threat to taxpayers was going to be the imposition of new tariffs. We worked very closely with the Trump administration on the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and more recently worked with them on the Tax Cuts Act. And it's been a great place to be in terms of advocating policies that I think are good on really a policy basis, not a political basis or anything like that. So that's kind of how I wound up where I'm at today.
Yeah, no, that's great. And coming from your dad, those insights that he gave you early on are still coming to fruition, it looks like.
Yeah, well, I hope so. And so there's always a lot of challenges. And there are, I say that as if, everybody should believe this, but there are a lot of people, it's really easy to have a zero sum viewpoint that, hey, that person's better off. I must be getting taken advantage of somehow.
Right. Right.
Then that can certainly happen. I'm not saying that it doesn't, but just as often, if somebody has a great idea and becomes wealthy, they do it by lifting the rest of us as well.
Yeah, yeah. What about this, Bryan, from the side of philosophically and otherwise? Are there certain economists or philosophers or others that have helped you learn more about trade and understand the things that you do today?
The one I remember early on was reading Free to Choose by Milton and Rose Friedman. Coincidentally, I was too young to go, but Milton Friedman had spoken at Kansas State University on trade policy. And if you go to YouTube and Google, or go to YouTube and search Milton Friedman tariffs, you'll see him speaking at Kansas State University, talking about free trade, producer versus consumer, and really going through a basic explanation of how tariffs hurt us. And so that was a little bit of the basis in terms of my trade policy. I don't know the overall economic, supporting economic freedom, if that just came from family or something I was born with. I know you're a musical guy, Vance,
drummer.
And so, well, then you're familiar with a band called Rush. And, so I might have learned as much listening to Rush as I did reading Milton Friedman or Black Sabbath, Ronnie James Dio.
There you go.
Ronnie James Dio had a line, the world is full of kings and queens who blind your eyes and steal your dreams. And, I think we've got some politicians who still try and get away with that. So
that's true. That's true. Hey, I remember, the late Steve Horwitz also really liked Rush a lot.
Yeah. Well,
it was one of his favorites.
As a lot of us do, as a drummer, I'm sure that was easy stuff that was like warm up for you, probably doing those songs. So.
Oh man. Yeah, he's phenomenal. But no, that makes a lot of sense. And, Friedman was one of the ones who got me on the direction that I am on the more classical liberal, libertarian sort of mindset and philosophy, and continuing to read and learn from them. And I've watched that video, Bryan, on YouTube, and a lot of other of Milton Friedman's presentations at different places. And, at some point, I'd love to do that as well. We need more people talking about these things out there and taking the heat and these lion's den almost of going into these universities. We don't have as much of that these days. And as you know, and write about a lot and talk about a lot, we've got a lot of folks who are pushing back on these free market ideas of free trade. And seems like they're just blaming everything on free trade. And maybe a good place to start, Bryan, is to talk about NAFTA. We could go in different directions on this, but I think with your work on NAFTA in the beginning, having it pass in 1994, some of the reforms that were made then, and of course we had Ross Perot's famous, the giant sucking sound that was going to come from all the jobs leaving and everything else. But what has your research kind of shown in the data and evidence that supports it on what happened with NAFTA and where we're at today? Because one of the things, just real quick on that, Bryan, is I was in the Trump administration from June 2019 to May of 2020. So right as I was getting in is when the USMCA was getting finalized and signed and all that. And, my point was, even before I went into the administration, was the USMCA is actually more problematic than NAFTA. It created more barriers and appealed to the labor unions of parts of origin and all this other stuff that I actually feel like it made it more barriers, not less. And but I wanted to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, a lot of people would agree with you. If you're an automaker, for example, you're probably not a big fan of USMCA. The one thing I wanted to that you mentioned that caught my attention was the giant sucking sound of what was supposed to happen, according to critics, after NAFTA. And the idea that who would want to invest in a factory in the United States where our workers are paid so much and we're going to get wiped out. Everybody's going to produce in Mexico, China. And so there are absolutely examples of where, certain industries have gone to produce overseas. But I really want to stress this. You can go to the Commerce Department, anybody, and look it up. They're proud of the fact that the United States is the biggest magnet in the world for foreign investment. It's not China. It's not Mexico. It's the United States. So if we have good policies here, Vance, whether it's trade policies or tax policies or education policies, people are going to want to do business here and create jobs here. And in fact, so I would argue we've benefited a lot. And that sucking sound that people were worried about, the sound was actually more of foreign investment flowing into the United States and creating jobs here as well. NAFTA was, when President Reagan first announced that he wanted to run for president in 1979, he said, I want to have a North American accord between all three countries that moves in this direction. And at the time, it was a pipe dream to think that we would have North American free trade. But he managed to pursue a U.S.-Canada trade agreement. President George H.W. Bush and Clinton completed NAFTA negotiations. And none of these deals are great. None of them are perfect. It's like legislation. Sure. You get a big 500-page bill. You hope that there's more good than bad. And what I define as a good free trade agreement is something that just reduces or ideally eliminates as many barriers as possible. Sometimes in talking about trade policy, it's easy to overcomplicate things. To me, all free trade is when you or whoever's listening, when you earn your paycheck, you should get to decide how to spend that money and how to invest it. It shouldn't be somebody in DC based on who's got the best lobbyists or the most powerful, political state or cases like that. It's the same as any other, market-based transaction. Free trade is simply you should be able to spend your money how you want to. NAFTA moved us in that direction, and it was demonized for the next 20, 30 years, where everything that was wrong in America, it's NAFTA. It was because of NAFTA, and it was easy to blame it on NAFTA. At the time, it's a long time ago, Mexico, where there were concerns Mexico was going to be a failed state, or at the time we had the Soviet Union, we had Cuba as an influence, and imagine what things would be like if Mexico had gone down that road instead of modernizing. And people in Mexico are a lot wealthier than people in China for the most part, on average. Many auto producers will tell you it saved our auto industry. We've had I have to look at the exact number, but since NAFTA went into effect, the volume of autos produced in the United States, measured in real dollars, has gone up by about 60%. So big increase in auto production here. And in part, that's because as supply chains, we can source some goods from Mexico, some from Canada, or we can make the parts here, assemble the car there. The parts will go back and forth across the border without paying tariffs, without paying taxes. And that's allowed us, to prosper. And, in part, it's attracted, the investment from automakers around the world. So a lot of the jobs, somebody in Ohio or Michigan might say, oh, NAFTA was terrible. This is bad for us. We don't make as many cars here as we used to. Well, there's some truth to that, but the rest of the story is, we're building cars now in Alabama and Texas, and Tennessee, South Carolina. It's just moved to, states that I would suggest have more, business friendly policies that make companies want to locate there.
Yeah, no, great points there. And some of this tension that's there, and just for us to name it, I think there's more of this populist right versus the free trade, free market, freedom conservatism, whatever you want to call it, classical liberalism. There's this tension that's been happening, and I think it's always been underneath there to a certain level, but it really has come to up to the main stage, if you will, since President Trump became president, or even as he was running during his campaign back in 2015, going into 2016. And so you've seen this free trade, and you've been a consistent voice on this. So I wanted to get your thoughts on this. Is what do you think is driving this political shift away from open markets? And then how can we start to turn some of this around? I think you've mentioned some of this already, but where's your mindset about the protectionism versus free trade? And how can we get back to more of a free trade mindset?
I think it's primarily President Trump doesn't think trade is good for us and thinks other countries are ripping us off. And when he first came into office, he was saying this. It's not like this is any surprise. And many people thought or hoped that, well, he's saying this, but it's really a negotiating strategy that he's using to get other countries to bring their tariffs down. In many cases, you get presidents who come in with similar views, and then they hire people around them who say, look, there's more to the story. And if we start putting tariffs, if we put a 50% tariff on imported steel, we're going to have problems if you're a manufacturer in the United States trying to build goods with steel, or if you're in the construction industry and you're trying to build houses with steel. I'm not a mind reader, but I think he really believes this. The phrase populism, it to me implies popular, and I don't view these as necessarily popular bottom up policies. I think they're top down policies, whether they're coming from the president or whether they're coming from people they'll call themselves populists. I think they're elitist. I think they're incredibly elitist, trying to tell people how to live their lives, how to spend their dollars. If you look at polls on trade policy, on tariffs, there's no groundswell of support for this stuff. Now it depends on how you ask the questions. Most people, 8 years ago, you ask them what a tariff was, and they would probably be like, well, I don't know what you're talking about. Now everybody maybe knows what a tariff is. Now the exception might be any poll I read. Again, most Americans don't like tariffs. You know what else Americans don't like is inflation and high prices. Mm-hmm. Right? We can get back to that later. But a significant chunk of the Republican Party will tell you now, we like tariffs. And in the past, they wouldn't tell you that. I strongly believe that, those Republicans answering the polls that they like tariffs, they don't like tariffs. What do I mean? They love President Trump. Right. They love him, and he likes tariffs. Thus, they like tariffs. If President Trump were to watch this podcast and say, well, boy, that Bryan guy made a lot of good points. So we're going to do what Milton Friedman said and just go unilateral free trade, get rid of everything. I would suspect most of those people answering the polls, we love tariffs, would now answer, we love getting rid of the tariffs. It's certainly an issue that's bigger, and more significant in the past. And even though I said it's all President Trump, it's really not all President Trump. There are a lot of groups that have emerged in recent years who have, started pushing, what I call protectionist trade policies. I think really almost anybody would call them protectionist trade policies, where it's attempting to empower the government to decide what we can buy, how much of it we can buy, what price we can pay for it, taxing goods, taxing investment, all these different ideas. And they spend a lot of time on Capitol Hill, and they've been successful. There've always been people making those arguments, but going back, not just Milton Friedman, but going back to Adam Smith, I think one of the first thing I did when I came to NTU was we did a letter from economists to Congress and administration, urging against the imposition of tariffs. Okay, lots of people have done letters like this, and I just little policy analyst in DC, and we started by getting some fairly prominent, very prominent Nobel Prize winning economists, names everybody would know, before we went out more broadly to get signatures. And I was thinking, man, how do I write this letter? I don't want to manage 6 different Nobel Prize winners and edit their stuff, or I'm not cocky enough. Maybe I should be to write something and get them to sign on. So what we did, we just went back to 1930, when right before the Smoot-Hawley tariff, there was a famous letter from economists. The American Economics Association contacted their entire list and said, President Hoover, don't do the Smoot-Hawley tariff. It's going to be a disaster. And that almost word for word, the same language from 1930 is applicable today. We updated a little bit so it didn't sound all, old timey. And so we got bipartisan Republicans, Democrats, people who've served in both administrations, who signed onto this. The view of economists is, overwhelmingly in support of trade. And so, I hope that counts for something. However, I don't think people should just take their word for it. I don't think we should just take the word of experts saying, oh, here's the way things work. I think we need to challenge them. And if they can't explain it, then try other things. But, there's a lot of people out there trying to explain this stuff.
Yeah, no, wise words there, Bryan. And, kind of digging into that a little bit more, I think when many Americans hear tariffs, they think about it as being a penalty in other countries. I mean, that's how Trump has phrased it. Peter Navarro, others in the administration are saying we're going after them. They're taking advantage of us. And nobody wants to be taken advantage of, especially not the most powerful country in the world. How are they taking advantage of us? And so we've got to go after them somehow. They're taking our jobs. They're taking our manufacturing, right? These are the stories we've been told. And I remember, Bryan, whenever I was going up to Virginia, we lived in McLean at the time, and we were driving up there with my family, and I listened to some audibles on the way, and I listened to The Art of the Deal by Trump, and there's a lot of mentions in there on tariffs. I mean, he's had this belief for a long time. It's not something new. And if you read Peter Navarro's book, Death by China, I mean, he really believes that China and others are, or especially China, but it's an existential threat. And so we've got to do everything that we can to go after them. But with these sort of things like a tariff as using as a negotiating tool, I wonder what you think about it as being a negotiating tool. My thought is maybe it brings them to the table, but why would you want to raise taxes on your own people in order to bring others to the table when you're trying to help your people in the process? It just doesn't make any logical sense to me. But I wonder, what are your insights there? Do you think it's okay for that? Or should we be thinking about tariffs on China, given who they are? What are your thoughts, Bryan?
Well, the two thoughts, I'll probably have 20 thoughts, but we're going to try and keep it at two. The first is Art of the Deal. What I remember about the Art of the Deal is President Trump saying, I never get too attached to any one approach. If something doesn't work, I'll try something else. I think we have found the exception to that rule. Because it's the tariffs all the time, all the way. And unfortunately, you mentioned Peter Navarro. He's got, advisors, whatever you want to call them, around him who really are, giving him, encouraging him to exaggerate and make these policies even worse. It's like Peter Navarro's got a PhD in economics from Harvard, right? And he's a very impassioned guy. He's a former losing Democratic congressman who was on stage at the Democratic National Convention with Hillary Clinton, but that doesn't mean he's wrong. But I'll tell you what I think he is wrong. If you're concerned about China, Vance, if you're concerned about China, why in the world are you putting a 50% tariff on goods from Canada or Mexico or Europe or Japan or Indonesia or Korea? all of the countries that we should be working with to strengthen our security and to strengthen our economy. My background is economics, of course, as yours is, but growing up in Manhattan was roughly an hour or so from where Dwight Eisenhower was from. And every now and then I'll go back and read some of his annual reports to Congress. And when he talks about trade policy, he talks a little bit about economics, as most Republican and Democratic presidents did at the time. But this guy was also the supreme Allied commander who helped win World War II. And he talks about how we need strong relations with our allies. That helps us. We need access to supplies from if our allies can help supply steel or raw materials that we need at a more affordable price than we could produce them domestically. That's a good thing. So this stuff is all working more closely with our allies probably is a better approach to dealing with China than policies that have, people in Canada booing the national anthem and taking our goods off the shelves and everything else. So, I'm a free trader. But I do support, the reasonable restrictions on trade with China where it affects our national security. But a lot of our tariffs, they don't have anything to do with national security. And I feel that the way many people talk about trade, not all, but a lot of them, to me, it just comes across as very condescending and dismissive, saying things like, well, Americans don't need cheap goods from China. And if you're a trust fund kid who went to the Ivy League and you're set for life, you probably don't need to worry about it too much. But if you're a blue collar worker and there's a single mom trying to put your kids through school, having some cheap goods is not a bad thing. At all. And if you look at the price levels of things like furniture, we import a lot of furniture, shoes, clothing, toys. Yeah. Imports, the prices have stayed flat or gone down during this era that I'm talking about since 94, where the overall price level has just gone up, up, up. Now, does that mean there haven't been some disruptions? Well, there have. Sure. My grandmother worked in a shoe factory. That shoe factory is long gone. And, you know what? We need to be able to contend with those kinds of changes, but to try and turn back the clock, to 1979 or 1950 or 1870 or whatever year, we're going to, that's just going to make us poorer.
Yeah, I agree. And Bryan, what's interesting about all this too is, I think you really hit the nail on the head there though, about who decides what we should buy, who decides what toys I want to buy for my kids. I've got 3 little kids. Who decides where I want to go to the supermarket? It should be me. It shouldn't be the government telling me what I can buy, what I can't buy, because that's ultimately what they're doing with all these controls, and the trade is limiting our choices for us to meet our desires and meet our level of satisfaction. So when they come out and say, we don't think you should be buying cheap goods, how do they know? They don't know my preferences. They don't know any of those things that's going on with me. And it's really, I think it's becoming a situation where, so you put it to a good point earlier, that they are the elites. They know better than we do, and therefore they need to make these changes. It's a very top-down approach, not a bottom-up approach. And in fact, the bottom-up approach, where we've had it, has allowed for free trade to work. And Bryan, one of the things that I'm kind of concerned about, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, is you brought up some good points earlier that I've been trying to make as well, is it's not like when we started having free trade and more trade and globalization and all that automatically these jobs just left the United States. I don't think that businesses want to necessarily send jobs overseas and stuff like that. But whenever you're in that quote unquote Rust Belt, in those states that had high labor union dues and forced union labor dues, they had high taxes, high spending, high regulations. Well, those businesses are going to say, well, where else can I go? I want to be profitable. And so they go to the Sun Belt and others that have lower cost of doing business. And then once they can't get as much profitability there, then they go to China and other places. I don't think this is like the first thing that they want to do. And so the other part of this that I've heard from the NatCons and others is that we need to bring back manufacturing. there's like this infatuation with manufacturing that if we're not manufacturing all the things that we used to, like you said, the 1950s or the 1870s, then somehow this isn't a prosperous economy. And so I wonder what your thoughts are about the infatuation with manufacturing. Should it be there? Is this the right route to go? And how can we start to better tell the story of the problems that we face in America already are leading to this? And we're pointing our fingers at China and other countries, but really it should be about us lowering the cost of doing business. What are your thoughts there?
It should be about us lowering the cost of doing business here. Absolutely. We should control what we can control, and certainly not try and adopt central planning that we see fail in country after country around the world. I think that's very important. The number one thing, talk about manufacturing. Any of you go to the Federal Reserve website, type in FRED, short for Federal Reserve, for their website, and type in any manufacturing indicator, output, real industrial output, whatever. And we're, if not at an all-time high today, we're pretty darn close to it. And that increase in U.S. manufacturing continued and expanded throughout what I call the what critics would call the era of hyper globalization. Yeah. Big increases in manufacturing. Now, there were fewer jobs because we're more productive and could produce more with less. And again, growing up in Kansas, I always learned as a farm kid that was better to produce more with less. That's a goal that we should strive for. But if you look at other indicators, for example, manufacturing unemployment rate, there was no increase in manufacturing unemployment after these trade agreements were signed, after China joined the World Trade Organization, which suggests to me that jobs may have been moving around, but it's not necessary that it's untrue to say, well, everybody just got laid off and, lost their jobs forever. In many cases, people were leaving, because they could find, better jobs. And I skipped over something that you asked earlier that I'd like to go back to that I think is important. Sure. You're talking about, the idea of using our market to leverage access to other markets, and whether by threatening retaliation or reciprocity, there are different words for it. I've heard several people in this administration refer to the golden rule of trade policy, and their golden rule is you treat others the way they treat us. That's not the golden rule, right?
Right.
But second of all, it's not a very constructive approach. Why would we want to copy other countries' bad policies? And all it does is lead for this eye for an eye. Reagan had this story. This is my first Reagan quote of this. I can't believe I've held off for so long. But we're all on the same boat with our trading partners. If our trading partner shoots a hole in the boat, what should we do? Some people should say we should shoot a hole in the boat and call it getting tough. He said, I call it stupid. We should be patching up the holes. So the golden rule is, correct me if I have misstated this, you treat others the way you want them to treat you. And so I'm going to suggest this, not a religious, or biblical or anything like that. But in terms of trade policy, that's something that actually works better than a lot of the other approaches that we've seen. If other countries know that you have their best interests in mind, as well as your own best interests, they're more likely to work with you towards mutually beneficial outcomes. You get this get tough approach. Maybe you can get away with it once. But most countries are aware that, if we capitulate, there's just going to be more of it coming. I'll be the first to acknowledge there are examples of where Trump's tough trade policy has encouraged some positive changes in other countries. But overall, the costs, I think, far outweigh any of those benefits. And the risk, of course, is, as we learned during the first Trump administration, where Peter Navarro said, we can put all these tariffs on and nobody will retaliate against us because they need our markets. Well, guess what happened? Everybody almost everybody retaliated against us.
Yeah.
So again, going back to being from Kansas, if you're a farmer or a rancher, you talk to any farmer, at least in that part of the country, they'll tell you, I don't want subsidies. I don't want to rely on the government. I want access to foreign markets. I want access to markets, and those are often foreign markets. Now, if you're a Florida tomato producer, you might feel different because you don't like the idea of having to compete with year-round fresh tomatoes from Mexico. So you go lobby Congress or the president to get some tariffs put on. What really blows my mind. So that's like the traditional economist way of why do we have tariffs? You get these powerful special interests. They don't want to compete. They go, persuade Congress to protect them from competition. We had, this morning reportedly, General Motors lost $1 billion due to tariffs. So we have a situation not just where it's the steel industry saying protect us from competition, but we're putting tariffs on autos, auto parts, aircraft, industries that don't want the tariffs. They want to be able to compete worldwide. So it's a little bit different approach than maybe what most economists, at least the way I was brought up when we thought about why we have tariffs. And I will add one more thing. And then turn it over to you because, these thoughts just start flying around. Because I think I may have misled people a little bit earlier, and I don't want to do that. Because I was talking about, buying shoes from China. Most of what we import is not shoes from China or clothing. Right. Most of it is raw materials or parts or capital goods that we use to make things in the United States. And so
like intermediate goods,
exactly. Yep. So I really think one of the best things we could do is say we're going to get rid of all these tariffs on intermediate goods so that if whether you're a farmer and you need fertilizer or you're an auto producer and you need steel or parts or whatever it may be, we're going to allow you to compete by bringing down your costs, not by increasing your costs.
Right. Yeah, it doesn't make any sense. It's counterintuitive and it goes against the policies. And so along the same lines, Bryan, is I was for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, because I thought that was the better way of going after and putting pressure on China than tariffs and other things, because you get all those allies. And if they're not trading by the same rules, which a lot of times China doesn't, then those countries are unlikely to trade with China too, even though it's a huge market. And that would put more, because I actually don't think that China cares, Bryan, about our tariffs. They're a communist government. They can just do whatever they want to do. Why do they care as much about us? If people are unemployed, you don't get as many rights in the streets. Maybe you will at some point, and that will be some overturn. But to provide peace, to provide certainty, one of the main things that I'm hearing across businesses, Bryan, is the uncertainty has kept them. It's paralyzed their business. I mean, they don't want to invest in the future because they don't know what their cost structure is going to be. And so this is going to have a ripple effect. And yes, we've had the on again, off again, which has led to more of the uncertainty. And now they're saying August 1st is going to be the day when it all happens. And we'll see. I doubt it, but maybe we'll see something. But even if you look at the tariff rates before and after the 10% across the board, I think it was closer to 2% was our average tariff. Now, if it's 10%, that's 5 times higher than what it was. And they were getting on to Biden for all the Biden inflation and everything else. And yet they're raising prices. Now, one thing we should note to the audience, Bryan, is that this doesn't mean inflation will go up the way we measure it with CPI. It will be specific prices given those items that have a tariff, and the relative prices could change. And because right now the administration is like, oh, where's the inflation? All these people, Bryan and Vance, you're wrong, because the inflation's not coming up, but it's out there. It's just not, we don't see it in that measure. But what do you think about some of those ideas?
You don't see it in that measure. And the other thing is, you mentioned some of the timing of when these tariffs were announced, and then they were paused, and then they were given certain exemptions. A lot of businesses were able to import and stockpile and warehouse goods before the tariffs went into effect. So we haven't had time to see what the overall price impact is going to be in in my opinion. And there are probably some cases where some businesses have said, look, I'm going to try and eat the cost of this for I can do it for a while. They're not going to be able to do that indefinitely. So if the tariffs stay in place, it is going to show up in terms of putting upward pressure on prices. You're very wise to explain the difference between that and changes in inflation. And then, of course, how the Fed responds to any of these policies creates a lot of changes as well. But so in the meantime, it is very hard for me to write a press release on a Friday morning when there's an announcement, because it changes like 8 times between then and the end of the day.
Yeah.
How in the world, if I am a business producer trying to decide what to put on the shelves for Christmas, and where to source my parts, it's really challenging.
It is.
And you touched on something earlier that maybe is one of the biggest challenges I find. So the idea, one of them, the objections I hear all the time, you've mentioned most of them, that we don't manufacture anything anymore. Well, we do. And if you want to bring back the t-shirt job, President Trump has said, I don't want to bring back the t-shirt jobs. I want to bring back the high-tech jobs. So I agree with him there. But the phrase trade deficit.
Yeah.
That is one of the biggest challenges that I find, to explain to people, what the trade deficit means or doesn't mean. And if I could give you an example, I'm talking about tomatoes all the time because we're just putting big tariffs on Mexican tomatoes. But if I go buy a crate of tomatoes from Mexico for $100, I have just increased our trade deficit by $100. Now, how much do I owe Mexico? I don't owe them anything. I paid them for the tomatoes. Yeah. How much do you owe Mexico, Vance Ginn? A stupid question. Why would you owe Mexico money because I bought some tomatoes?
Right.
Now, how much does America owe Mexico because I bought tomatoes? Nothing. But I don't like deficits. Nobody likes deficits. And the Bureau of Economic Analysis, every month they throw, here's our deficit. We had this deficit. It sounds like money's being drained from the country. It sounds like we're being harmed. But the only reason we have a trade deficit, the primary reason, let's say this, that we have a trade deficit is because we're the best place in the world to invest in. So, Mexico takes some of those dollars that I spent on tomatoes, and instead of spending it all on corn, they spend some on corn, and they spend some and they invest in the U.S. stock market, or they buy some treasury securities. So as a result, we have a trade deficit, but if you account all the balance between all the goods, it all balances out. And sometimes I'll tell people, look, if you want to get rid of the trade deficit, just just say any treasury bonds and purchases of U.S. stocks, we're going to count those as exports, and boom, problem solved. So President Trump, there is your solution. Just change the way you define this stuff, because it's very confusing and misleading.
And Bryan, just for the audience, right, that'll be the capital account, or all the treasuries and stocks, versus the current account, which is the goods and services. So we have a deficit for current account, but a surplus on capital account that all basically equals zero. I mean, they equal each other over time. And the other thing that's interesting there too is GDP, of course, it's exports minus imports. That's the trade deficit that they like to look at. But the only reason why they subtract out imports is because you're looking at what's produced domestically. And so it's already in consumption and investment. So if you include imports, you're actually double counting. So it's really just an accounting identity that they've then turned into this bad thing of being a trade deficit, which doubles down on their view of the hollowing out of the Rust Belt, the hollowing out of the middle class, and globalization, all the other nonsense. It's almost like MMT, which to me is more of an ideology. Modern monetary theory is more of an ideology than a good theory. And I think this just goes back into their ideology that maybe we're coming full circle now, is that they do care about the distribution of that pie. They talk a good game about pro-growth policies of deregulation and tax cuts, but they don't want to cut spending, which if we got our spending and fiscal house in order, they wouldn't have many treasuries for us to have to issue. And therefore, that would help out with our capital account and our current account, but they don't want to do that. And yet they have to blame everybody else for these problems because they don't want to admit it on their own. Because to me, free trade is about peace, prosperity, and the future of our country, because I want to trade with Bryan. I don't want government telling me that I can't trade with you. And the same thing goes with the Chinese, because another big part for me, Bryan, is countries don't trade with each other. The last time I looked, people trade with people. And letting people prosper is what that's all about. So as we're wrapping up things here, which has been a great discussion, what would you like to, as a reminder for the audience today, and where's the best place to find you?
Intu.org is the best place to find our work on taxpayer policies in general, on our free trade initiative. I am on Twitter at Free Trade Bryan. That's Bryan with a Y. Where, as Vance knows, I get a little bit carried away sometimes, maybe more entertaining for people who care about such things. And I wanted to mention it's easy for me sometimes to get discouraged by the way things are going on a short-term basis, but I'm actually optimistic in the long run. When I hear Democrats, let's say Democratic leaders talk about trade policy today, it used to be that it was all, oh, this is a race to the bottom, or, oh, some corporation is going to be making money somewhere. This is all terrible. Now they sound a lot more like John F. Kennedy. Kennedy said our trade policy is based on the proposition, that both parties to a transaction benefit. I think he was right about that. So Democrats from FDR to Harry Truman, Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich passed what at the time was the largest global tax cut in history, the year going around trade agreement that created the World Trade Organization. So I'm hearing more of that from Democrats. Now, some people might say, well, that's just because they don't like Reagan. If they got back in power, it'd just be the same old stuff. But I hope that's not the case. On the Republican side, I talk to Republican staffers every day. Many of them will say, look, they will ask me for advice, and I totally fail them, because they'll say, we're hearing from constituents who are having big problems for the reasons you mentioned, the business uncertainty, trying to decide what crop to plant when Brazil's going to get the whole soybean market for China. Who knows?
Right.
But we're a Republican and we have a Republican president. What are we supposed to do? And that's a tough situation to be in. But when I talk to people like this, I don't like to predict the future, but I will be very surprised if we ever have a Republican administration in the future that decides that unilaterally imposing hundreds of billions of dollars in tax increases without Congress is a good idea, and comes out on social media and comes out in their press office and says, look at all this tariff money rolling in, which of course is tax money paid by Americans. There is no love for that approach within the Republican Party. So my hope is that we avoid any real damage. I want to see President Trump succeed. I think these policies are an anchor around his administration. Get rid of them, and our economy would go through the roof, in my opinion. But my hope is that, without any long-term costs, no replay of the 1930 Great Depression, that we'll see, hey, look, we tried this. Did it work? Draw your own conclusions and then move forward from there. My experience in my advancing age is we know what policies work. And you go back to President Reagan, you go back to those mutually beneficial win-win trade agreements, that it's not us giving away the store. It's other countries lowering their barriers, agreeing not to tax our digital services providers, all that stuff that we want. That's the direction I think we can head to going forward. So that's, if I'm not exuberantly optimistic, I'm at least cautiously optimistic, Vance.
Yeah, I love it, Bryan. Well, thank you for being on the Let People Prosper show, and a lot of wise words today. And I look forward to the future work that you're going to continue to do. And God bless you and your family, Bryan.
Thank you, and thanks for the great work you do. It really means a lot, and excited to have a chance to talk to you, and maybe we'll have a chance to follow up before the year's out.
Yeah, definitely. That would be great. That would be great. And so thanks again, Bryan. And for the audience, thank y'all for joining us today. Hopefully you learned a little bit more about trade. Hopefully you can share this with your friends and family, because they too need to understand more about what trade is going on, the reality, and where we should be heading in the future, which is more freedom, more liberty, and ultimately more prosperity. Remember, you can find this information at vanceginn.com and go to my Substack newsletter to get it and get a paid subscription, if you will, to vanceginn.substack.com. So with all that going on, thank you for joining me. God bless you, and let people prosper.